Hi, everyone, and welcome to AXA Coral Live. It's fantastic to have you with us, and it's a great lesson. This is for sort of ages 14 to 16, and we're looking at the future, or perhaps it should be futures, possible futures for the coral ecosystem. This is the third of a sort of 3 live lesson sequence. So on Tuesday, we heard from Dr. Michelle Aclatis and looking at an introduction to the coral ecosystem, the distribution, the formation, the composition. And then yesterday, we had a great talk from Dr. Mark Vermeer, and he was talking about the relationship between humans and the coral ecosystem, both in terms of the uses of coral, and also looking at the impact that communities and people have had on the reef around the world. Both those videos are available to watch on catch up on the Encounter EDU website via the live lessons section or on our YouTube channel, which is Encounter EDU. So really excited to be looking at the futures today, looking at conservation measures, restoration measures. It'll be absolutely fab. Before we get going, a few things. We've got some shout outs to give. We've got schools from the UK, USA, France, and the Netherlands joining us today. Fantastic to have you all with us. And a big hello to all the geographers at Crollerton Grammar. Wonderful to have you. I've had a very fun time speaking to some of your classes before in person. And a big welcome to Ellesmere Port Catholic High School. Great to have you all with us too. A few bits of housekeeping in terms of interaction. So there are 2 ways that you can interact. You can interact using YouTube chat. For that, you'll need to have an adult. If you're watching from home, a parent, carer, guardian. If you are watching at school, probably a teacher. They'll be logged into a YouTube account, and the chat bar to the side of the screen is where you can type in any questions or comments. Just remember, you might be full screen, so you've got a better view, so you can always use a secondary device to be able to type those questions in while you're watching live. There's also a chat function on the Encounter EDU website. There's a small white speech bubble in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, that encounteredu.com. Both those methods will get through to Sim, who's moderating for us today, and then he'll send that over to me. Now, we have had an angry iguana on the shoreline in Curacao, and I'm just making sure that has been shooed away. And welcome Dr. Valerie Chamberlain, who is our speaker today. Valerie, okay, so Valerie's still, apparently I've just heard through from production that Valerie is still shooing away iguanas. And so what we're going to do is, before we start, is to give you that idea of what a healthy reef and what an unhealthy reef looks like. And so where we have been in the past, where we might go in the future, and which of those 2 we want to be working towards. And here's a video to give you an idea of what those look like underwater.
Coral reefs are distributed around the tropical belt of the ocean. They are hotspots of biodiversity and home to many creatures. Today, there are fewer and fewer healthy reefs that are bursting with life. It's getting harder for corals to grow and reproduce on their own. And the tiny coral babies have a hard time surviving. In fact, our world is changing rapidly. . Corals are dying and reefs are declining worldwide. How can we address this magnitude of loss?
So I hope you've got an idea there of what a healthy reef looks like and what an unhealthy reef looks like. And I think that Valerie has been successful in shooing the iguana away from her perch on outside the Kamabi Research Station in Curacao, where she's based. Valerie, can you hear me? Have you sort of cleared the area?
Hi, Jimmy. Yes, I can hear you well. I have cleared all the hazards.
Fantastic. Just before we get in, and thank you so much for being part of this live lesson, looking at the futures of coral. Whereabouts are you at the moment? For those watching who haven't joined us before.
I am on the small island of Curacao. It's a small tropical island, really completely all the way to the south of the Caribbean. So we are actually on really clear days. We can see Venezuela, South America on the horizon.
So Venezuela over that way for you?
Yeah, I can actually show. I'm now sitting at our research station, the Kamabi Research Station, and in the background we have a view on the sea. So I'm now sitting at our pier, and like I was saying, on very clear days, you will be able to really discern on the horizon the mountains in Venezuela. So we are really close to South America.
Amazing. And Valerie, I mean, where's the reef? I mean, are you literally sort of, a hop, skip, and a jump from coral?
Pretty much, yeah. The reef here on Curacao is a fringing reef, so it is only like a few meters away from shore. So most of the sites around, I would say 40, 50 meters away from shore. So we can just walk in over here and do a lot of the scuba diving for research just from the station.
Absolutely amazing. Now we have this live lesson on the futures of coral. How would you describe the trend in global coral over the last sort of like 25, 30 years?
So the coral reefs in general all over the world are, and on average, not doing well. A lot of coral reefs have declined, so there's less and less corals, which also means less and less biodiversity on those reefs. As you probably already know from former lessons, corals are kind of the building houses or building blocks of coral reefs. So corals have been declining generally throughout the world in the last few decades. But that's not the case for every reef, and it's not all doom and gloom. There are still corals that are, able to bounce back a little bit.
And I'm not sure we're showing on screen that sort of like that very sort of like clear downward trend, and that's from the IUCN looking at species going towards risk of extinction. That sort of straight line of doom and gloom. But when you talk about ecosystems, we're then talking about it, we don't have this straight line necessarily with reefs around the world. And I think students may think about, the Great Barrier Reef, one of the most, perhaps the iconic reef system on the planet. And that's experienced sort of ups and downs over the past 25 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the reefs that are infected, for example, by global warming or coral bleaching are capable, if there's not too many stressors at the same time, after some of the stress has passed, those corals are capable in many occasions to survive and rebound and start regrowing and reproduce again. So it's all about the amount of stress that's all happening at the same time.
And so you talk about stresses, and yesterday when we were talking to Mark, we covered some of those stresses, and I think we got an overview. I mean, stresses, threats, I think often sort of used interchangeably as terms. And you have, I think we went over things like sort of overfishing, coastal development, ocean warming, ocean acidification, water quality, those kind of things. when we're looking at the future of the reef, is there just one solution that we can do, like sort of forest management, where we can just close off a bit of forest, or do we need a mix of management strategies?
Unfortunately, Jamie, there's not just one solution. So and also it's not just like one remedy for all the reefs. Every coral reef is different, and generally we have to approach a problem with interdisciplinary approaches. So we have the more classical methods of doing conservation through, fishing regulations, making sure we don't overdevelop the coast. Those are all more like management actions. And then there are a bit more active or direct interventions that we can do in the ecosystem. And that would be, for example, to increase coral cover through restoration, to remove invasive fish species or algae species. So those are more human interventions in the ecosystem. And they really go along together. If you start adding more corals to a reef that is already doing really bad because, for example, there's a big source of pollution from shore, if you don't remove that source of pollution, the new corals you're adding to the reef are also not going to survive. So it has to be made in a very holistic or multi-approach setting.
And one of the things you sort of haven't mentioned, which students watching may have come across in the news, is maybe something you can't do on a local basis necessarily, like next to a reef, which is this twin problem of a change in ocean temperature, this warming, and then a change in ocean chemistry, this increase in acidity, this lowering of pH. Is that something that's conservation work, or is that a bigger issue that you have to deal with?
Yeah, so we can classify those problems in two different categories. The first one is global issues, global problems, like you mentioned, global warming, ocean acidification. And then there's more local threats, like pollution directly on shore. That's something that can be easier addressed by a small island like Curacao or by people in the fields like me. Going against global warming and ocean acidification will really depend on how your government's policies, and how we work as a world together. So it's a little bit harder to fix than the local issues that can be addressed through, like I mentioned, management of our marine resources, like implementing management or implementing areas where you don't fish, making sure our coasts are not overdeveloped, all those kind of things.
And it would be great, and I know for those watching, especially those who are doing ecosystems for their exams, case studies are always brilliant. Are there case studies on Curacao, and we'll just take it one by one, where water quality has been addressed in terms of marine and coral health?
Yeah, so on Curacao, we are, like a small island. We don't necessarily always have the same technologies when we talk about, for example, sewage problems. On Curacao, when it rains a lot, often our sewage system will overflow on the reef. This is not the case all the time, but it can happen. At the moment, we're working really hard to fix those sewage problems to help preserve our coral reefs. But we very much see, the impact if you have an area that is exposed to all those nutrients and bacteria from the sewage. It really has an impact on the corals directly affected by that problem.
And then with overfishing, and just to help young people understand that relationship between overfishing and reef health first, and then look at what that looks like in practice on an island like Curacao.
Yeah, overfishing can mean that you're removing fish species that are really important for the functioning of a reef or of an ecosystem. So, for example, some of our key species would be the grazing fish, all of those like parrotfish that are grazing the algae from the substrates. And those algae are in competition with corals. So those algae are actually very bad for the reef if they are too abundant. And so if you start with a nutrient problem by because of the sewage, those algae, they eat those nutrients. So what happens is that those algae have a lot of food for growth. So they start growing, multiplying. And then if you don't have the grazing or herbivore fish to eat them away, then you have the double of a problem because they're growing faster, and there's no one to remove them left on the reef. So that's the link between, for example, overfishing that can accelerate degradation of reefs if you don't have the key species anymore.
And then how do you just ban fishing altogether, or how do you balance livelihoods and reef health?
No, you cannot ban fishing altogether. You know, fisheries are part of the community's income, culture. You know, we need fisheries for the island to keep, you know, and that's not just for Curacao, but many places around the world depend directly on fisheries from coral reefs for food and income. The best strategy for managing fisheries properly is to designate certain areas of an island, of a country, where along certain areas of the coast you're allowed to fish and other areas you are not allowed to fish. And in those areas, the goal is that fish populations will be left alone and they are able to repopulate themselves. And eventually those areas will create overspill. So all those fish that are in the protected area will eventually be moving around the reefs that are nearby. So kind of helping the populations of fish around the island.
Amazing. And is it, you know, looking at marine protection and I think, you know, marine protected areas or no take zones, is that just on the sort of strip along the coral reef, or do you have to include other habitats as well to protect the fish?
It's important to know that fish, many reef fish species, don't have their entire life cycle on the reef. So some fish species, people from the Caribbean will very much know the yellow snapper, for example, a very popular fish for fisheries, really good fish to eat. Most of those species are actually born in nursery areas that are more inland. So they will spend a big time of their life in the mangrove area and in the seagrass beds. And eventually they will start moving towards the coral reef and establish themselves as adults on the coral reef. So if you don't protect the areas that are connected, you know, those other ecosystems, then you're going to be, for example, all of the juvenile fish are not going to be able to survive. So even if you would protect the stretch of reef, you're going to be missing one step in their life cycle. So it's not going to work for their protection.
And do I understand right that at the moment Curacao is looking to designate some new marine protected areas?
Yeah, exactly. That's very exciting. We are looking at a few protected areas for fisheries around the island. That's very, very exciting.
Where am I heard is it the East End, or is it wider than that?
There will be 7 different ones, if I recall correctly, that are spread at different strategic points around the island where we know that fish populations are already thriving.
Absolutely brilliant. And I think the last one that'd be really good to cover is that, I mean, certainly I know that when we've been in Kamabi in previous years, you know, there, you know, just around the corner from you is a lot of, you know, classic sort of 1980s, 90s, or even perhaps earlier sort of coastal development of high-rise hotels, looking at sort of mass tourism, that kind of thing. Do you see that changing at all, so that, you know, that there is less coastal development and putting less pressure then on the reef?
There's definitely a change in direction and the type of tourism that we are looking at. I think generally the population that wants to travel now is more interested in what we call ecotourism, or tourism where you don't necessarily just, you know, lay on the beach with your cocktail, that you actually go around the island, look at nature, whether on land or underwater. So people are more looking into smaller, more charming or homey places to stay during their vacations rather than really large hotel chains. And that's great because it prevents, you know, that we have to build a lot more very large resorts right close to shore. So that's really great, and we see that on Curacao more and more, that people are not necessarily looking for the really big hotels anymore.
Wonderful. And although you managed to battle away the iguana, the cockerels deciding to join in.
Yes,
it's all happening, but we'll get you loud and clear. So Valerie, I mean, what for me is really interesting, and just to summarize, we have the sort of global strategies that we need, and with the sort of Paris Agreement and the international cooperation on bringing down greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, also personal responsibility for that. We've got those great examples of local strategies, including MPAs or marine protected areas, zoning, so that developments are built in a more eco-friendly way, and then the need, although I don't know whether it's quite happened, to look at how you improve sewage systems and how important that kind of technology is to conserving the reef. The third one I think we've touched on is sort of, before we get to sort of that, in fact, how important is research and science in developing those solutions?
Research and science is, I would say, one of the first steps needed to change those policies and regulations. We need to be well informed. For example, when we speak about choosing in which areas we do no fisheries zones, no take zones, there needs to be research beforehand to decide on which areas is going to be the more productive or the wisest choice. A lot of the research that has been done in the past was to better understand coral reefs to begin with. And now more and more research is more solution-based or applied-based oriented. So we are more and more shifting our focus, instead of simply understanding how the coral reefs works, we are doing a lot of research to understand how we can make it better, or help the recovery of coral reef. So that's really a big shifting interest or shifting direction of research in the last years.
And Valerie, I mean, is it right saying that you're part of this picture insofar, and correct me if I'm wrong, but sort of giving nature a helping hand in that recovery stage, not necessarily and how you can help nature, support nature bounce back. Is that a fair summary of the work you do?
Yeah, it is one of the tools that we can use to help recovery. So
So tell us what occupies, when you're not speaking to us, what are you up to?
So in general, I am busy doing research once again on coral reef restoration. So restoration is one, like I mentioned much earlier in this presentation, is one of the approaches that we can use in combination with management or conservation actions. So restoration is a way to increase the number of corals that are on the reef. It is a more active intervention in the ecosystem. So we really try to multiply the number of corals that we are putting on the reef to help the next generations of corals.
And so I mean, there must be sort of many different aspects to that. Can you sort of take us through the actual sort of process that you go through? Because I mean, it's amazing that you sort of seem to run a sort of coral nursery stroke sort of work placement stroke housing things. I mean, it seems like a full service for corals to get out and be healthy on the reef.
Yeah, so our approach to reef restoration is to work with baby corals. So we work with coral reproduction. So the idea is that about once or twice a year, corals reproduce in the wild, and so they release their eggs, and then we catch those eggs, and we actually make baby corals out of them. They come to the lab, where we do all of the fertilization out of the ocean in the laboratory. And then we study those baby corals so that we can understand what they need to be healthy, grow, survive, and form the next generations on the reef. So we do a lot of research with those baby corals, and then eventually are placed back on the reef, where hopefully they will continue growing and survive and help restore and help the recovery of coral reefs.
So it seems that there's two stages, one of which is that I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of the species you work with are do what's called sort of broadcast reproduction, where there's like hundreds of thousands or millions of eggs into the water, and it's a strategy based on a sort of lottery that if we do it enough, then a few will work out, and by bringing that into the lab, you increase those chances. Seems to be one section. And the second section is about, I've seen all your tiny little tripods and pink colors and white colors and this colors is helping them sort of work out a sort of starter home package.
Yes, exactly. So to go back to the process of coral reproduction, or we call it broadcast spawning, we should have a video of that event. It's actually amazing. It's beautiful. So like I mentioned, once or twice a year, all the coral parents, they synchronize themselves to release all of their eggs in the water column. And those eggs are buoyant, so they float up to the surface, and it makes a beautiful scene. It's almost like an underwater snowstorm. And at the same time, all the fish are out, all the little creatures on the reef, like little crabs, and everything is awake and participating to the spawning. So not only corals are reproducing, but also other organisms like little brittle stars and, like I mentioned, urchins and crabs. So it's a big, amazing spectacle underwater. And what is now happening is that, for reproduction to happen, two different parents, a male and a female, like in mammals, they have to be able to, that their gametes or their eggs, they have to meet for fertilization to happen. And because now we have less and less corals on the reef, sometimes the distance between two parents of the same species is too big, and fertilization is not going to happen. So part of my work is to go catch those eggs from different parents and bring them together in the laboratory in a single bowl, where we mix a lot of different parents together. And that really allows reproduction and fertilization to take place. It's, like sometimes hundreds of thousands of eggs would have been lost because they would have never met a mate or another parent. And when we bring all of those together and mix them all together, we can optimize sometimes fertilization all the way to 99% to 100% of fertilized eggs. So we really give them a chance to for reproduction to actually happen. And then the next step is once those eggs have been fertilized, they develop into baby corals that we grow in the lab. And we have to provide them with, Jamie talked about starter homes. I have one over here. I can show quickly. So these are tetrapods. They look like, little triangles. And on those tiles, we allow the baby corals to attach. And that actually helps a lot because we can then handle those tiles and bring them to the reef together with the baby corals. So those eventually are being transplanted directly on the reef. And if everything goes well, then we have growing corals on those tiles that can help repopulate the reef.
And so you're talking about different problems. One of the problems that you're helping to solve is that parents, adult reproductive corals may be too far apart. And this comes to some coral science I don't think we covered in the first lesson, just maybe go over it. Is it important that in providing the starter home is because there isn't anywhere suitable just to let the sort of young, adolescent corals go and do their own thing?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, Jamie. We talked earlier about, how algae that are growing in response to nutrients coming from, for example, from sewage or agriculture. So algae that are growing on the reef, if they are not grazed or eaten by those parrotfish or herbivore fish, they are going to be overgrowing the reef. And you can imagine if they are already harmful for giant, adult corals that are hundreds of years old and sometimes more than a meter diameter. Imagine how harmful they can be for baby corals that are sometimes 1 millimeter, less than a millimeter big when they start growing. So those babies are going to be very rapidly overgrown by algae. And that's one of the challenges that those baby corals have to, deal with to survive. But those starter homes, they give a little bit of extra space for the babies to grow before the rest of the world comes in and competes. There's also, you can see those little grooves.
Mm-hmm.
We call them microhabitats. So in those grooves, the coral babies, they really like to attach within those small grooves. And what it does is that they're a bit more protected. So, they have their backs sheltered from potential algae and sometimes also predators.
And Valerie, give us a sense of numbers. And I know you work for an organisation, Seaports International. So and there are sister projects like yours, I think, happening in other locations. But give us a sense in Curacao and maybe further afield. How many babies have you had? I don't know what the right word in coral babies, and then how many little ones have you planted out on the reef?
It would be impossible for me to have counted them all. It goes in the range, Jimmy, of hundreds of thousands so far. We've been working on this on Curacao since 2010 for Seacorps International. We are working with many different species. Every year we put thousands of babies from each species back to the reef. I think the numbers that are a bit more important to look at are not necessarily how many we put out on the reef, but how many are surviving in the end. We have great examples from many different species, but I think one of the most striking one is that in 2011, when I was just starting my research here, we grew young corals from, like I said, from the eggs from the coral spawning events, and we placed them on a reef a year later. And those corals are now still alive, and they are, at this point, 9 years old. And the special thing is that they have started reproducing themselves already 5 years ago. So at the age of 4 years, those baby corals were actually not babies anymore. They had reached sexual maturity and were capable of reproducing themselves in the wild along the natural populations from the reef. That was a really big success, and that's what we are. That's our goal, to achieve these kind of successes, to see our corals grow and participate also in the next reproductive events.
Valerie, absolutely amazing, and would love to talk more about or the amazing successes you've had in restoring this unique habitat. But we've got some questions coming through. And the first question is really interesting. It's from Union Point Academy in the USA. And you talk about having success with a certain species. Are some coral species more difficult to grow in a lab and to help in this restoration than others?
Absolutely. This is a really great question. That's something that we are trying to tackle at the moment, because we have to know that each coral species is very different from one another. If we talk about birds, we know that a pelican is very different from a colibri, for example, from a hummingbird. They have different requirements. They have different habitats. It's very similar with corals. Each species comes with different preferences, different sensitivities, and we have to take that into account when we grow them. And some species are definitely harder than others. One of the species that is a bit difficult is the Elkhorn Coral. That's one of the critically endangered species. And the development of that coral takes multiple days. So after the eggs have been fertilized, the babies remain as embryos for multiple days in a row. And at that point, they are very fragile. So when you are starting with this kind of work, it's way more challenging if you have to work really hard and keep them alive for those 4 or 5 days than if you work, for example, with a brain coral species that is finished within development within a day. So there's all kinds of differences like this that make it more or less difficult to work with different species.
And you talk about you have more success with brain and less success with Elkhorn at the moment, but working hard to resolve that. Does that mean, and this follow-up question from Union Point is that this coral restoration technique is applicable for reefs around the world, or are there some regions where this sort of restoration techniques are just too tricky?
No, there are techniques that we can apply around the world. But just to get back to the previous question, I just wanted to say that we actually do have a lot of success with both brain corals and the Elkhorn. We have figured it out. It was a bit more difficult, but it is working out now. These kind of techniques are actually applicable all over the world. We are actually working really hard to make them more accessible, so that we can use also lower cost equipment, more simple tools, so you don't need to have necessarily a really fancy laboratory, with super expensive aquarium equipment to make it work. So we are really trying to make those techniques more accessible. And at the moment, we have partnerships all over the world. In multiple Caribbean islands, we have been teaching these methods, but we are also now starting to work in the Pacific region. So we are really sharing our findings and protocols. And there's a lot of other laboratories also that are pioneering this kind of work in other areas of the world.
Amazing, Valerie. Absolutely fantastic work. Next question is a tricky one, but you probably have a view. Are you optimistic for the future of the coral reef?
I am. It's not optimistic as in being naive, but more optimistic into choosing to look at the hopeful stories. There's examples of corals that are doing really well in places where we wouldn't expect it. Some coral reefs are on Curacao. There's a coral reef that was able to keep growing even though the temperature of the water was fluctuating all the way up to 33 degrees Celsius every day. That was in front of a how do you call this? Like a water plant, where they make fresh water from a desalination plant, when you make fresh water out of seawater. And that reef, was doing extremely well compared to what you would expect. You would think they would all have died from coral bleaching, and for some reasons, those corals had adapted to these conditions. And I think these are the kind of stories that we have to study more and investigate more. What is it that makes those corals better at resisting to heat stress? And then these are the kind of things that make me hopeful that not all coral reefs are going to disappear. But it for sure includes, a little bit of work from our side to make this work.
And just a quick thing, a couple more great questions. Does that involving genetics work in the future, or in your current areas of research, to understand what on a genetic level what makes those corals special?
Yes, absolutely. So this is work in progress, where we are looking into, so what we looked at, to be a bit more precise, is that we found out that the parents that were growing in this kind of this warm area were producing offspring or babies that were also better at tolerating heat stress. So that really showed that there was a potentially genetic aspect to this, their capability to resist to heat stress. So we are looking into, which genes, and has it been passed along from the parents to the offspring? All of those kind of questions are being investigated now.
Amazing. This is a really lovely question and fantastic, and I'm looking forward to the answer. Is describing your proudest moment or biggest achievement in your career?
I think it was really the day where we found out that those Elkhorn coral that we outplanted were reproducing. I think that was, for the first time we had closed the life cycle. We had, put out corals that were less than a millimeter big, and then 4 years later they were much bigger size and producing offspring themselves. And that was really, for me, the highlights of my career so far.
I mean, I don't know whether we've got sort of photos or video footage of Elkhorn, but they are, swimming near or among or whatever you say. Can you describe that briefly? Because I mean, it's something very, very special, I think, for me, sort of in and above the sort of normal reef experience that you have.
Yeah, the Elkhorn Coral is really special. It grows really shallow, so sometimes it almost sticks out of the water when you have a bit lower tides or calmer waters. And it almost resembles underwater trees. It has big branches. Sometimes those branches are really, really thick. And then it creates almost like an underwater forest. And then really often they grow all intermixed together. So all the branches are intermixed. It's a really highly complex three-dimensional habitat. And because of that, a lot of fish and other types of organisms, like invertebrates, like, for example, octopuses, little crabs, it's full of life. So the Elkhorn coral is really a special coral. And then sadly, it's been declining a lot in the last decades. So mainly because of a disease that hit that species across the whole Caribbean.
And Valerie, we've got time for one last question, and it's an absolutely fantastic one. As we look at the different possible futures for coral, how do we find the balance between people, communities, and nature, the coral reef?
That's a really great question. I think I will try to keep it a bit short. But in general, I think the balance is between, being respectful of the environment. It's not that we should not develop at all anymore, that we should prohibit all fisheries, that these activities are part of who we are and how our race is functioning, but we should be able to do it in a more respectful and sometimes smaller scale, and being a bit less greedy in general about what we want to extract or use from the nature.
Valerie, thank you so much. Loved hearing about all of your work. The message of hope you give is fantastic. That the sort of the graphs of doom aren't written in stone, that we have choices to make, we have respect to give. And I think sort of as we end this, I think we've got a slide that we can probably keep up for about a minute or so, which looks at a lot of different ways in which those watching, you don't have to be next to a reef, you don't have to follow in Valerie's footsteps, but I think some of you probably have been inspired to think about it. But as you can be good coral citizens, and so have a look at those, have a discussion at home or in your classroom about some of those things you might want to implement at a school level. But thank you so much, Valerie, and thank you so much to all those watching. It's been wonderful having you with us. And it's a goodbye for now from AXA Coral. Bye-bye.
It was a pleasure. Bye, everyone.